son tried to evict me from my home to start his own family and buy a larger house in a different community. I'm a 65-year-old guy who's been a single dad for the last 32 years. My wife, Laura, passed away in a car accident when our son, Gary, was just 3. It was sudden and absolutely devastating. One moment we were a happy little family of 3, and the next I found myself alone, trying to figure out how to raise our boy by myself. Back then, I was working as a high school English teacher. Suddenly, I had to juggle my job and being a full-time dad. Those first few years were insanely tough. There were nights I'd sit on Gary's bedroom floor just watching him sleep and wondering how the heck I was going to manage everything. But day by day, we somehow made it work. Over the years, I turned down promotions that would mean longer hours or travel, and I missed out on social events and dating because, to me, Gary always came first. But you know what? I never resented it. Gary was my world, and seeing him grow into a happy, healthy young man made all those sacrifices worth it. As Gary grew older, things got a bit easier in some ways, but tougher in others. The day-to-day challenges of raising a kid eased up, but the emotional stuff got more intense. Gary started asking more about his mom, and I did my best to keep her memory alive for him. We'd go through photo albums together, and I'd tell him stories about her. It was bittersweet, but I wanted him to know how much she had loved him. Despite everything, Gary and I had an awesome relationship. We were more than just father and son, we were best friends. We both loved sports, especially baseball. Some of my fondest memories are of teaching Gary to pitch in our backyard. As he got older, we spent weekends hiking or camping. I was so proud when he got accepted into a good college. Watching him pack for his dorm was bittersweet, but I was excited for his new chapter. We stayed close during his college years. He'd call me for advice on everything from classes to girl troubles, and I cherish those conversations. After college, Gary moved back home while job hunting. That's when he met Jane. She was smart, beautiful, and came from a wealthy family. At first, I was happy he found someone who made him so happy, but as time passed, I noticed changes in Gary. He became more focused on material things, always talking about fancy restaurants and expensive gifts from Jane's parents. I tried not to let it bother me, reminding myself that Gary was an adult and could live his life how he wanted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was turning into someone I didn't recognize. When Gary and Jane announced their engagement, I was happy for them despite my concerns. I offered to help with the wedding expenses, but Gary insisted that Jane's parents were covering everything. The wedding was lavish, way more extravagant than anything our family was used to. I felt out of place among Jane's family and friends, but I put on a brave face for Gary's sake. After the wedding, Gary and Jane moved into a beautiful house in a fancy neighborhood, a stark contrast to the modest home where Gary grew up. They invited me over for dinner occasionally, but I always felt like an outsider in their modern home. Jane was polite but distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she saw me as an embarrassment. Over the years, I saw less and less of Gary. He was busy with his high-powered job and new lifestyle. Our conversations felt superficial, and I missed my son. But I told myself this was a natural part of growing up and starting a new family. About 6 months ago, I decided to retire from teaching. After 40 years in the classroom, it felt like the right time. I was looking forward to more free time for traveling or picking up new hobbies. When I told Gary about my retirement, his reaction surprised me. Instead of being happy for me, he seemed concerned and started asking about my financial situation. I assured him I'd been careful with my money and had a decent pension. I wasn't rich, but I could live comfortably. Then Gary suggested I sell my house and move in with him and Jane. At first, I was touched. I thought it meant Gary wanted to reconnect and have me be a bigger part of his life again. But then he started talking about how much my house was worth and how the money could help us all out. I loved my house. It was where I had raised Gary and made so many memories. Selling it had never crossed my mind. I told Gary I appreciated the offer, but I was happy where I was. He seemed disappointed but didn't push it. Over the next few weeks, Gary called more often, each time bringing up the idea of selling my house. He talked about how I could contribute to their household and how it would be a win-win for everyone. I started to feel uncomfortable with his persistence. Then, About a month after I retired, Gary and Jane showed up at my house unannounced to talk about my living situation. Jane did most of the talking, explaining how they were planning to start a family soon and how wonderful it would be to have me there to help with the grandchildren. But something about her tone felt off, like she was trying to sell me something. As the conversation continued, it became clear they wanted me to sell my house and invest the money in a bigger home they had their eye on in an even more exclusive neighborhood. In return, I would have a room in their house and be part of their family. It felt like they were trying to manipulate me, using the promise of family closeness to get my money. I firmly told them I had no intention of selling my house or investing in theirs. Gary looked angry, but Jane kept her composure, saying they were just trying to help me. After they left, I was completely rattled. I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that my own son, my little boy, who I raised all by myself, was trying to pressure me like this. I spent the next few days in a fog, really diving deep into our relationship, trying to figure out where things had gone off the rails. About a week later, Gary gave me a call. His tone was totally different. He said that since I wasn't being reasonable, they had no choice but to take things into their own hands. He dropped the bomb that the house I was living in was actually in his name. I'd bought the house when Gary was just a kid, and I thought putting it in both our names when he turned 18 was a smart move, a way to secure his future. Never in my wildest dreams did I think he'd use it against me. Gary said he had every right to sell the house as the co-owner and that he planned to do just that. I was floored. My own son was threatening to sell the roof over my head. When I protested and said this was my home, Gary hit me with, "You're retired now, Dad. You're just a useless old man. Jane and I have our futures to think about." The next few weeks were a living nightmare. Gary and Jane started showing up with real estate agents, giving tours of the house like I was invisible. It was like I was a ghost watching strangers walk through my home. One day I overheard Jane talking to Gary in the kitchen. She didn't realize I was in the next room. She said, "We need to get the useless old bones out of here. I can't believe you let him freeload for so long." Gary replied, "Don't worry, we'll get rid of him soon. He's had his time, now it's our turn." I was heartbroken. The son I'd given everything for now saw me as nothing but a burden. I didn't know what to do. That's where I find myself now. My son and his wife are actively trying to sell my home out from under me. They've made it clear they see me as just a useless old man in the way of their plans. I'm hurt, angry, and scared about my future. Never in a million years did I think I'd be in this position at 65, facing potential homelessness because of my own child's greed. How did our relationship come to this? Asterisk, asterisk. Update 1. It's been a month since my last update, and wow, things have taken some wild turns. The situation with Gary and Jane has only gotten worse, and I'm in a place I never thought I'd be. After my initial post, I decided I couldn't just sit back and let them sell my home from under me. I reached out to an old friend, Dean, who's a lawyer. We've known each other since college, and he's always had my back. When I told him what was going on, he was shocked and immediately offered to help me pro bono. Dean dug into the legal side of things and discovered that while Gary's name is on the deed, there are laws protecting me as a long-term resident. He explained that Gary couldn't just kick me out or sell the house without my consent. That gave me a bit of relief, but I knew this wasn't over yet. I decided to confront Gary and Jane head-on. I invited them over for dinner, hoping we could have a rational discussion in a calm, familiar setting. I spent the whole day cooking Gary's favorite meal, pot roast with all the fixings, the same one I used to make for his birthday every year when he was growing up. For a little while, it almost felt like old times, small talk about work and the weather. But finally, I had to bring up the elephant in the room. I told them about my conversation with Dean and how what they were trying to do wasn't just morally wrong but also potentially illegal. I hoped this would make them reconsider. Gary's reaction was totally unexpected. Instead of backing down, he got angry and accused me of threatening him and trying to manipulate him with legal jargon. Jane jumped in, saying I was being selfish and standing in the way of their future. I tried to stay calm, explaining that I wasn't trying to threaten anyone. I just wanted to keep my home, the the place where I raised Gary and where we made so many memories. But my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The dinner ended with Gary and Jane storming out, leaving me alone with a table full of half-eaten food. That night, I went through old photo albums, looking at pictures of Gary growing up. I couldn't reconcile the smiling boy in those photos with the man now trying to take away my home. The next day, I received a letter from a law firm representing Gary and Jane. They were challenging my right to stay in the house, claiming that as co-owner, Gary had the right to sell it. The letter was full of legal terms I didn't understand, but the message was clear. They were ready to take this to court. I called Dean immediately. He reassured me but warned that legal battles can be long and exhausting, both emotionally and financially. He advised me to brace myself for a tough fight. Over the next few weeks, my life became a whirlwind of legal consultations and paperwork. Dean was amazing, explaining everything in ways I could understand and guiding me through the process, but it was draining. I lost sleep, constantly worried about what would happen next. During this time, I started reaching out to old friends and colleagues. I hadn't realized how isolated I'd become, focusing all my energy on Gary and his family. It was a relief to reconnect with people who knew me and remembered the kind of father I'd been to Gary. One of my old friends, Susan, offered to let me stay with her if things got really bad. It was comforting to know I had somewhere to go if the worst happened, but the thought of leaving my home still broke my heart. As the legal battle heated up, Gary and Jane got more aggressive. They started spreading rumors in the neighborhood that I was mentally unstable and needed to be in a care home. Some neighbors I'd known for years began avoiding me, giving me strange looks when we passed on the street. The stress was taking a toll on my health. I felt tired all the time and lost my appetite. My doctor warned me about the dangers of stress at my age and even prescribed some medication to help. I've been taking medication to help me sleep, but no amount of pills could touch the ache in my heart every time I thought about Gary. Quick update. It's been around 3 weeks since my last update, and guess what? I got an unexpected visitor. Jane's mom, Elizabeth. I'd only bumped into her a few times at family events, and we definitely weren't close. She looked pretty uncomfortable standing on my doorstep, but out of politeness, I let her in. So, over a cup of tea, Elizabeth spilled the beans on why she was there. She'd overheard Gary and Jane talking about their plans and was absolutely horrified. She and her husband had no clue what Gary and Jane were up to, and they definitely didn't approve. She even apologized for Jane's behavior and offered to help however she could. Given everything that had happened, I found it tough to trust anyone tied to Gary and Jane, but as we chatted, I could see she was genuinely upset by the situation. She shared some heartfelt stories about her own dad, who she took care of in his later years. She couldn't imagine treating a parent the way Gary and Jane were treating me. Before leaving, Elizabeth handed me an envelope with a substantial check inside. She insisted I take it to help with legal fees or anything else I might need. Overwhelmed by her generosity, I tried to refuse, but she wouldn't hear of it. She made me promise to reach out if I needed more help. It was comforting to know not everyone in Gary's new circle was on board with his actions, but also pretty sad that my son's in-laws were showing me more kindness than he was. The legal battle just kept dragging on. Gary and Jane's lawyers were relentless, throwing every tactic in the book at us. Dean was doing a top-notch job defending me, but the constant back and forth was exhausting. One particularly tough day, I found myself sitting in the backyard, staring at the old treehouse Gary and I built together when he was 10. It was worn out but still standing. I remembered us building it, Gary's excitement with each nail we hammered, the pride in his eyes when we finished. Now, that same boy was trying to take away the home filled with so many happy memories. Lost in those thoughts, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Gary, our first direct communication in weeks. The message was brief and cold. "Dad, this is your last chance. Agree to sell the house and move in with us or we'll make sure you end up with nothing." This wasn't the son I raised. The Gary I knew would never threaten his own father like this. I didn't respond but saved the text. Dean had advised me to keep records of all communications. The next day, I had a meeting with Dean to strategize. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a commotion outside. I peeked out the window to see Gary and Jane with a group of workers setting up a for sale sign in my front yard. Furious, I rushed outside demanding an explanation. Gary said they were just preparing for the inevitable. I told them they had no right to put up that sign since the house wasn't for sale. Jane just laughed and said, "It will be soon enough, old man." I stood there helplessly as the workers finished up. Neighbors started coming out to see what was going on, adding to my embarrassment. That night, sleep eluded me as I replayed the day's events, trying to grasp how things had gone so wrong. Laura crossed my mind. I wondered what she'd say if she saw what our son had become. The next morning, I woke up to an even bigger shock. My front yard was full of people. Gary and Jane had organized an open house without my knowledge or consent. Potential buyers were wandering through my home, examining my belongings like I wasn't even there. Fuming, I called Dean, who advised me to document everything. So I started taking videos and photos of everyone, making sure to capture Gary and Jane's faces. Some buyers looked pretty uncomfortable when they realized I was the homeowner and hadn't approved the open house. As the day wore on, more and more people showed up. Gary and Jane were acting like they owned the place, showing people around and pointing out features. I even overheard Jane telling one couple that they were helping her poor, confused father-in-law transition to assisted living, which was a blatant, infuriating lie. Whenever I tried to explain the situation to potential buyers, Gary or Jane would intercept and steer them away. At one point, I heard Gary tell someone I wasn't quite right in the head. By the end of the day, I was beyond exhausted and heartbroken. After the last buyer left, Gary and Jane stuck around, clearly pleased with themselves. Gary had the nerve to tell me the open house was a big success and that they had several interested buyers. He even suggested I start packing. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Years of frustration and hurt spilled out. I told Gary exactly what I thought of him, of the selfish, greedy man he'd become. I reminded him of all the sacrifices I'd made and all the love I'd given him. I asked how he could do this to me and to the memory of his mother. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the old Gary in his eyes, but then Jane whispered something and his expression hardened. He told me I was living in the past and needed to accept that things had changed. Then they left, leaving me alone in a house that no longer felt like home. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge. I called Dean and said I wanted to take more aggressive legal action. He warned it could get ugly and that Gary and Jane might retaliate even more strongly, but I was beyond caring. I needed to fight for my home and my dignity. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings and court appearances. Gary and Jane's lawyers threw everything at us, but Dean was brilliant. He presented evidence of their harassment, including the videos from the unauthorized open house. He argued passionately about my rights as a long-term resident. Gary and Jane, the co-owners of the property, sat in the courtroom whispering to each other and their lawyers, barely glancing at me. It felt like I was just an obstacle to them. The stress really got to me. I lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and my doctor was worried about my blood pressure, telling me to stay calm. But how could I, when my own son was trying to make me homeless? As the court case was wrapping up, Jane's father, Robert, unexpectedly visited. He looked uncomfortable but got straight to the point. He was ashamed of Jane's behavior and disappointed in Gary. He offered to buy Gary and Jane out of their share of the house to keep the family from falling apart over money. His offer was kind, but I was cautious and told him I needed time to think and talk to my lawyer. After discussing it with my lawyer Dean, we set up a meeting to hash out the details. Robert brought his lawyer, and after hours of negotiations we reached a fair agreement. Robert would buy out Gary's share and I'd keep my house. Gary and Jane would get the money they wanted for a new home, but I couldn't sell the house for 5 years, and they would have the first right of refusal if I decided to sell later. The deal went through, but Gary and Jane were furious, feeling like their parents had taken my side. Gary called me, accusing me of turning his in-laws against him and saying he never wanted to see me again. Those words cut deep. Once the legal stuff was over, I focused on getting back to normal. I heard Gary and Jane bought their dream house. Months later, Jane's parents sent me a photo album with a recent picture of Gary and Jane in front of their new house with a "baby on board" sign. They were going to be parents. I wrote Gary a letter, congratulating him and expressing my hope that we could reconcile. Months went by without a response. Then one morning, Gary showed up at my house. He looked different, more serious. He hugged me without saying a word. It was awkward at first, but then we both relaxed. When we pulled apart, there were tears in his eyes. He simply said, "I'm sorry." My son Gary apologized one day over coffee, admitting he'd been a jerk because of the stress of fitting into Jane's world. Becoming a dad made him realize how badly he'd treated me, especially as things got tough between him and Jane. They'd started counseling, helping Gary see how he'd lost his way. As we talked, I saw glimpses of the kind, thoughtful boy I raised, now more mature. Gary shared news about their baby girl due soon and asked if I'd be part of her life. I was touched but made it clear we needed to rebuild our relationship slowly. We agreed to meet for weekly coffee. Gary even asked if I'd be there for the birth, which surprised me. After meeting regularly, and also with Jane, things started to improve. She apologized too, explaining the pressures she'd been under. 2 weeks before the due date, Jane went into early labor. I rushed to the hospital, and after hours of waiting, I met my granddaughter, Lily Laura. They named her middle name after my late wife, which deeply touched me. In the following months, I spent as much time as possible with Lily, and my relationship with Gary and Jane got better. We talked openly and worked through our issues. So, that's my story over the past 2 years. Thanks, Reddit, for all your advice. Now it's time for me to cherish the moments with my family.